We calculated that we could reach the enemy in 12 to 14 hours and raced with new vigour toward the new targets. Despite the enormous strain of battling blizzards and enemy for 7 weeks, the crew's morale was at its peak. Somewhere in the east, where the night had already settled on the ocean, rocked the convoy, its officers and seamen constantly alert to the threat of being spotted, attacked, decimated, mutilated, killed. That threat grew with every mile, and was the greatest in the centre of the Atlantic. And that point was reached the following night. 2 hours after the sun had sunk into the water, the moon rose behind fast-moving clouds. Its pale yellow light was no help to us. In fact, it hindered our shooting at close range. As the night grew older, the violent winds abated slightly. Borchert, our man with the magic eyes, saw the shadow first. Destroyer heading north, distance 4,000. "Keep her covered, son. Tell me when she turns," said Siegmann quietly, without leaving his quarters. We had no way of knowing if we had been detected. Our Biscay Cross had long since been stored away, because it was of no use during attack or in the centre of the Atlantic, where no enemy aircraft had yet appeared. Soon the shadowy escort dropped out of sight. Time was 2130. For the next 2 hours we cut through a wild night of howling winds and brief snow squalls. We beat the sea to spray and foam, creating a large whirlpool aft of our half-sunken conning tower. The white water would divulge our presence to any enemy in close proximity. 2240. It was again Borchert who spotted the convoy. "Shadows on port, distance 6,500. It's the whole herd." The shadows, dots the size of bugs, moved along the indistinct moonlit horizon. Long rolling waves hid the ghostly parade periodically. We approached the fleet from the southwest, trying to cut into its starboard column. Soon we reached a point 4,000 metres south of the last row of ships and rode parallel to them, ahead of wind and sea, to establish all target values. 2330. The first destroyer of the inner cordon shot out of obscurity. For a few minutes she cruised at high speed between us and the convoy. Then she turned 120 degrees, sped right into our wake, changed course again, and closed in fast on the last column of slow-moving targets. Racing along their southern side, U-230 advanced far enough for Siegmann to swing into attack position. But as soon as we turned, the boat began to rock hard, causing our treacherous white wake to spread wider and glisten in the moonlight like a thick torch. A shadow separated itself from the black background, and the silhouette of a destroyer loomed up sharply. She was not alone. A second escort emerged from behind her. We turned and chased away into the valleys of the long waves, saw the escorts dash south, kept them covered for 60 seconds, then swung around again and resumed our assault. Though U-230 was continually shaken by hard breakers, she moved inexorably into firing position. Far on port, 3 sweepers patrolled rigorously, while 2 escorts swept the surface astern. Ahead of us steamed one of the largest convoys ever to sail the Atlantic. Shadow after shadow crawled through the lenses of my TBT, and their masts stuck up along the horizon like a heavy picket fence. "Destroyers astern, closing in fast," our first mate muttered. Without using my binoculars, I saw the monsters darting at us. White foam leaped from their foredecks and bridges. U-230 made no evasive move. We had to fire at the shadows first. "Exec, select your targets," Siegmann howled into the storm. "Tubes 1 to 5, stand by," I shouted into the hatch. "Ready, ready." "What are the fellows astern doing?" That was the captain again. Before the mate could answer, I thumped him in his ribs, told him to keep quiet, and reported, "Holding steady." It was not the truth. The escorts were gaining. I corrected my values, then lined up the shadows before our bow for execution. One by one they wandered through the crosshair of the TBT. I aimed carefully at the fattest targets. "Time is up, exec! Shoot!" cried the captain. I pulled the lever 5 times. Immediately, Siegmann turned his boat toward the tail of the convoy to shake off the pursuing destroyers. We smashed head-on through the giant waves, a feat the escorts could not duplicate. Then we heard the terrific rumble of 3 hard explosions. Blinding flashes revealed innumerable cargo ships, destroyers, and trawlers. 3 of the vessels careened out of file, floating torches. The armada made a sudden turn to port, firing its distress flares into the sky. U-230 thrust her sharp bow westward and raced into the black wall of another winter storm. Confusion, excitement, and the fireworks subsided. Silence followed. 2 of the stricken vessels broke apart in the heavy sea. The 3rd victim had drifted out of sight. We never saw her sink. The convoy disappeared in the stormy vastness of the ocean. U-230, barren of torpedoes, retreated from the battlefield. Throughout the night, we observed more flashes and heard the bellowing of more detonating torpedoes. When the morning sun rose, dispelling the fog and sending red and gold clouds into the light blue sky, when the snowbanks melted over the steaming and chaotic sea, the Allies had lost 14 ships, over 90,000 tons. 6 more vessels were drifting damaged in the choppy ocean. U-230, low in fuel and short on food, started on her way to port. We transmitted a summary message to headquarters. Sunk 7 freighters, 35,000 tons. 2 more damaged, set for base. As we proceeded southeast through the blizzards, the battle with convoy SC-122 went on with dramatic fury. When March 17th came to an end, 8 more cargo ships had sunk into their graves. As the night of March 18th closed in on the hunters and hunted, the thunder of depth-charge explosions and torpedo detonations erupted anew, and the convoy's desperate fight against annihilation continued. Throughout the following day, U-boats were still pursuing the enemy, biting and shooting their way through the shrunken fleet. Then the U-boats suddenly detected another convoy in the wake of SC-122. They hacked their way through screens of escorts, blizzards, and mountainous waves, and pushed into the flanks of eastbound convoy HX-229. New fighting erupted. Soon the 2 stricken convoys fused in a gigantic holocaust where over 130 cargo ships, over 30 destroyers and corvettes clashed with 38 U-boats. The battle raged for another 2 nights and 3 days. Great tracts of ocean echoed to the sharp reports of torpedo hits and the sound of crushing hulls. When the U-boats ran out of fuel and torpedoes, when new blizzards covered the stricken convoys with snow and sleet and fog, when their battered remnants finally reached the protection of British long-range bombers, only then did the infernal battle come to a halt. It had strewn the bottom of the Atlantic with Allied ships. A laconic report by U-boat headquarters described the dimensions of our victory. In all, 32 vessels of 186,000 tons and 1 destroyer were sunk, and hits were scored on 9 other ships. This is the greatest success ever achieved in a single convoy battle, and is all the more creditable in that nearly half the V-boats involved scored at least 1 hit. While one of the largest naval engagements in history had claimed 32 British, American, Dutch, Norwegian, Greek, and Panamanian ships, we had lost only a single U-boat. U-384 had fallen victim to the bombs of an aircraft of the British Coastal Command in the last day of the giant struggle. 4 days later, U-230 approached the western fringes of the Bay of Biscay. Our rusty, dilapidated boat was making 14 knots. Siegmann announced that our destination was Brest, the port where I had left Yvonne. I was pleased by my prospects and overjoyed with our spectacular victories. Everything seemed to be right with the world. Unknown to us aboard U-230, our homeward journey through the Bay of Biscay was to be a harbinger of troubles to come. March 25th, the 5th day after the colossal convoy battle, passed uneventfully. With ballast tanks pre-flooded, deck awash, and our METOX warning gear tuned in on the enemy above, we proceeded cautiously eastward into the growing evening. That night we made 3 radar contacts. 3 times we crash-dived, and 3 times an aircraft dropped a cluster of bombs in our wake. The next morning at 10:12, Borchert with his magic eyes stretched his arms and yelled, "Aircraft!" Spotting a tiny black fly diving at us out of the cloud cover, I tossed the Biscay Cross into the tower and my men plunged after it. With our deck already submerged, I glanced at the aircraft and guessed that we might have a grace period of 30 seconds before its bombs exploded. Then I tumbled through the hatch and slammed the lid shut just as the sea crashed in upon me. U-230 had dived in just 18 seconds, leaving a margin of safety of at least 10 seconds. As the boat churned into the depths at an angle of 50 degrees, the plane zeroed in on the foamy spot of our submergence. 4 bombs detonated just short of our starboard-aft ballast tanks. The explosions hurled our stern out of the water, giving the bombardier the impression that he had scored a fatal hit. Down below, we were surprised, for no radar impulses had been received. We remained submerged for over a half hour. Then we surfaced, but only briefly. 12:25. Crash dive before a 2-engined aircraft. No radar impulses. 12:50. U-230 surfaced. 13:32. Alarm, aircraft. No radar detection. 4 bombs exploded in close proximity, causing our rear planes to block in down position. 14:05. We surfaced at high speed. 14:22. Alarm. 4-engined Sunderland. Hard rudder manoeuvre. 4 more bombs, short Sunderland. It could not be denied that the British had laid a tight screen of aircraft over the Bay of Biscay. Siegmann decided to run submerged during the day and to travel on the surface at night only, when the Tommies would be forced to resort to their radar to find us. Nevertheless, that night was no different from the day. We crash-dived 3 times, evading 12 more bombs by meagre margins. We stayed submerged throughout the next day, floated at a slow speed of 3 knots through the depths, and listened to the threatening propeller sound of a hunter-killer group that the British had stationed in our front yard. We also heard the constant rumbling of faraway detonations. Surprisingly, the bay was very much alive. After dark the next day, we were forced to make 6 crash dives, each time receiving the inevitable 4 charges. But each time we managed to escape and come up to surface again. The next day we spent sailing submerged at 60 metres, but not without sporadic and inexplicable explosions. At dusk we surfaced, and around midnight penetrated a large fleet of French trawlers fishing for sardines. Their presence saved us from further harassment. When occasionally we heard the roar of aircraft engines, we drew close to the trawlers, frightening the fishermen with our manoeuvres. Soon after daybreak, we finally arrived at the spot where we were supposed to meet our escort, but the sea was empty. Everything seemed to be going wrong. Our prospects of reaching port soon were not exactly overwhelming, and they dimmed even more when we learned from a distress signal that U-665 had been sunk by aircraft only 1 hour before she was to be met by her escort. We dived and waited. The Coast Guard vessel eventually approached us just before noon, 6 hours late. Siegmann waited until the ship was so close that he could see the colour of her skipper's eyes in his scope. Then we surfaced. Pale-faced men poured out of the hull, eagerly inhaling fresh air. Some of them went about attaching cartridges to the guns, while others fell on deck, taking their first insecure steps. A faint, violet strip starboard ahead announced our approach to land. The first green patches, white walls, and red roofs soon showed clearly in the sun. U-230 reached port without firing a single shot. The captain, looking like a Viking in his long red beard, smoked his cigar with satisfaction. His men had assembled on the aft deck, smoking and joking, their faces yellow in the sun. An ovation burst forth across the inner harbour as I manoeuvred our boat toward a concrete pier overcrowded by welcomers. A band played while those men on their first patrol stood stunned by the attention they were receiving. Even our handful of veterans found it a moving affair after 8 weeks of battling the storms, the sea, and the enemy. Ahead of us rose a giant concrete structure at the water's edge, the bomb-proof U-boat pens that harboured well over 40 wolves. U-230 nosed into one of the berths of this newly constructed bunker. Both half astern, both full stop. Fasten all lines. The shore party fell silent. The boat's company steadied into firm ranks. I presented the crew to the captain, and Siegmund saluted the commandant of the 9th U-boat flotilla. As we pale-faced, bearded celebrities teetered over the gangway and stepped cautiously on solid earth, we were showered with flowers and kisses from the always enterprising girls of the administration. Staggering on our shaky sea legs, we stowed our gear in one of the multi-storied pastel buildings that housed the 9th U-boat flotilla. I noticed that our compound was well maintained and closely guarded, and that large camouflage screens had been built over several structures to deceive enemy aircraft. The modern complex would serve well as a home for my stays in port. Before I had a chance to shave, we were caught up in a round of homecoming receptions and celebrations that lasted long into the night. Proud of our accomplishments and almost desperately eager to enjoy ourselves again, we overdid everything. We gorged ourselves on the plentiful food of Brittany. We drank too much French wine. We sang and joked and laughed with loud abandon. No one objected to our excesses. It was comforting to know that others understood our needs after our weeks of anguish. The next morning at 08 Mo, I mustered the crew in a paved courtyard. Only a few men appeared for roll call. The rest were incapacitated. For the next few hours I was kept busy reviving the men, especially Riedel and Friedrich, and preparing papers for the captain's report to headquarters. It was only after 16 hours ashore that I was able to think of myself. I repeated the ritual of rejuvenation, remembered well from my returns to Lorient. I took a long hot bath, carefully removed my 9 weeks' growth of black beard, put on a clean uniform, sat with eyes closed as a barber cut my hair. Then, as a new man, I sorted out and read my accumulated mail. First, I opened the pink envelopes from Marianne. According to one of her letters, things did not look good in Berlin. The English were here again, 4 nights last week and twice in one day. The raids are frightening. As you know, I work in the centre of Berlin, and last week we spent long hours in the air raid shelter in the cellar of our office building. While I was there, a bomb hit the building across the street and destroyed it entirely. There were no survivors. All were buried alive in the basement, so what good is it to seek shelter in a trap? When I finally left for home and saw the burning and destruction and the dead, I cried almost all the way. My best girlfriend was buried in the rubble that day. I can't understand why we don't drive the Tommies away. This is the nation's capital and should have more protection. It's hard to say where we are going from here. Goering promised that no enemy plane would ever cross into Germany. We wonder what has happened to him and his pledge. We have not heard of him for some time. Yesterday I listened to a news bulletin about our U-boat's new success in the Atlantic and thought of you. Darling, I pray that you always return from your missions to find my letters. I think of you constantly and want to be with you. Please, take care of yourself. When the war is over, everything will again be as it was on Lake Constance and under the chestnut tree on that long, hot summer night in '39. I was disturbed. I thought of urging Marianne to leave the big city and settle somewhere in the country, for the time being at least. The news from my parents was less dramatic. Mother wrote of a few unsuccessful air raids in the Frankfurt area. She said that people had organised to help each other extinguish small fires in their attics, that some English pilots had been shot down, that father was working hard in his business, and that Trudy, now a war bride of 7 months, was still assisting him as his secretary. I was satisfied with the news from home, and in my letters to both Mother and Marianne, I wrote that all would change for the better very soon. This I firmly believed, despite growing evidence to the contrary. The air raids on German cities had increased steadily in size and frequency, passing the point of mere harassment. The radio and newspapers were vague in their reports of bomb damage and casualties. but I got the impression we were now taking severe punishment. There were other bitter facts to be faced. Only reluctantly did I accept reports that adverse developments had taken place on the Eastern Front while we were at sea. Apparently the Soviet winter offensive had resulted in our defeat at Stalingrad, where our Sixth Army had been beaten. The news from the North African theatre was not encouraging either. The British were advancing more or less steadily in the desert. Nonetheless, these reverses seemed to me to be of local character and unlikely to affect the outcome of the war. Actually, the only front where Germany registered dramatic gains was the one at sea. The Battle of the Atlantic was going well for us. Our U-boats, now operating in large wolf packs, were taking an incredible toll of Allied shipping from the Arctic Circle to the Caribbean Sea. This March of 1943 was the greatest month in U-boat history. Our boats had sent to the bottom almost 1 million tons of Allied shipping. Currently, close to 250 U-boats were in action on various fronts, in training in the Baltic, in port for refitting, and in shipyards nearing completion. As for the future, our boat-building program bore the stamp of top priority. Even in the sea war, however, our triumphs were now being wrenched from the enemy with a difficulty unknown in previous years. As the size of the convoys increased, the coordination of British and American naval units had sharply improved their convoy defences. Escort vessels of a new type, the swift and highly manoeuvrable corvettes, increased the hazards of U-boat attacks. Most ominous of all was the plague of enemy aircraft. More and more planes were flying ever farther to sea and bombing our boats on the homeward run or outward bound with ever deadlier accuracy. The threat from the sky had added a new dimension to the sea war, and we were hard put to keep abreast of rapidly changing conditions. As I saw it, the whole war now hinged on our U-boat effort in the Atlantic. It was obvious that the Allies had had time to recover from our early blows, and that they owed much of their new vitality to supplies shipped across the Atlantic from the United States. We of the U-boat force had to prevent American food and ammunition and airplanes from piling up in British ports and on the docks of Murmansk and Archangel. We had to annihilate the enemy at sea before he could mass the material and manpower for an invasion of Europe, and we would do it. With the help of all hands, U-230 was quickly stripped for refitting, and at the end of our second day in port she was put in charge of the Naval Yard's engineers. Work on the boat was only a fraction of my hectic schedule in those first few days in port. I continued making charts and reports for Siegmann's meeting with Admiral Dönitz. The captain was to go to Paris, where Dönitz had established his headquarters after being elevated to Commander-in-Chief of the Navy in January. Also, I made arrangements for sending 1/3 of our crew on leave. Despite my heavy workload, I found time to think of Yvonne and, late one afternoon, to pay her a surprise visit. Armed with a bouquet of flowers, I entered the bookstore where she had worked. She was not there. I did not wish to involve the proprietor in our personal affairs, and so, thinking that Yvonne might have changed jobs, I began searching for her in the other bookshops in town. But Yvonne was nowhere to be found. I finally made the long walk to her house, where I had spent many nights. There was no Yvonne, or at least no one admitted to knowing her. On my way back into town, I hurled the flowers over a stone wall, convinced that I would never see her again. Then, on a sudden impulse, I returned to her bookshop and addressed the old proprietor behind the counter. "Pardon, monsieur, où est-ce que je pourrais trouver Yvonne?" "Yvonne? Oh, Yvonne." He peered at me over the rim of his spectacles, and then informed me of the obvious. "She isn't here." I repeated my question. "Tell me, please, where can I find her?" "Young man, all I can tell you is that she left 8-9 months ago, to live in Toulouse with an aunt, so she said. But," he gave me a significant glance, "she had to leave the city. Didn't you know she was persecuted for her association? Things like that can't be kept a secret." The old man's look was not one of hate. There was only sadness in his eyes. This was the last I heard of Yvonne. 2 days later, the commandant of the flotilla arranged a party to celebrate our successful patrol. At lunch in the officers' mess hall, he revealed his plans and invited everyone to attend the affair, which was to be held at the flotilla's country resort, Château Neuf. At the end of his announcement, the commandant said with a smile, "I have provided the place, the food, the drinks, and a dance band. But you gentlemen will have to provide your own female companions." This, I soon learned, was no easy matter in a town full of regulars, officers who never went to sea. When the bus came to take us to the party, the regulars had the company of pretty nurses and government employees. We womanless newcomers had no choice but to concentrate on the fresh, blooming landscape of Brittany. Just after sunset, we arrived at the chateau, a 17th-century castle nestling among rolling hills. There was little time to admire the elegant architecture and lavish appointments. The hall filled up fast, and I soon found myself shaking hands with many old friends and classmates, including Fred Schreiber. To open the party, the band played Tiger Rag, then continued with French, German, and English tunes. The food and wine were French and of excellent quality. The eating started early and continued late. The dancing ended after midnight as the lucky couples disappeared one by one into upstairs rooms, where the drapery was velvet and bedding pure silk. The drinking, which was the lot of us dateless guests, went on until wine and weariness conquered all but a few diehards. I put Riedel and Schreiber to rest in a bed once used by lords. Then I found my own peace in an overstuffed armchair. After this grandiose reception in his behalf, Siegmann, a staunch family man, departed for his home in Hamburg. En route he was to make his report to the Admiral in Paris. My fellow officers took their cue from the captain and left to spend 2 weeks with their families. I remained on duty with a handful of our men in Brest, but duty was now a relaxed routine. The countryside was bountiful in these serene April days. I visited the chateau at will. I splashed in its huge sunken marble bathtubs, sampled its extensive library of old books, went pheasant shooting with the farmers of the neighbourhood. I watched the buds open and unfold under the warm breezes from the sea. The scent of spring was everywhere. One mild evening I was introduced to the racy life in port by new friends who shared my fate. We had been sipping cocktails, playing cards, telling jokes and seamen's yarns in the bar at the base. Suddenly Forster had an inspiration. "Listen, friends, how about a nice little celebration in town? The night has only begun. Let's end it at Madame's place. Shall we go closed ranks to the CB?" His proposition was adopted by acclaim, and it had its appeal for me as a newcomer in officers' circles in Brest. As for the merry endorsement of Forster's suggestion, I asked my classmate Schreiber, "What's so special about this CB, Fred?" He finished his gin fizz and said with a broad smile, "The C stands for casino and the B stands for bar. The casino bar is a place where one can forget his griefs, drown his thirst in good French wine, and satisfy his appetites with Madame's beauties, all in absolute privacy. So this is a fancy établissement, is it? Call it by any name you like. It is highly recommended." We marched through the blackened city and came to a halt at an inconspicuous door identified only by a small light and the initials CB. The door was locked. A young lieutenant rang the bell in a special way, a signal that we, only we, were at the door. An old woman opened the door a crack, then recognized some of my friends. As she swung the door wide open, I heard the laughter of girls and a phonograph blaring the song "J'attendrai le jour et la nuit." Inside, dim red lights created a suggestive atmosphere. As we filed in, gay greetings came from both sides of the entry to the bar, and my friends answered boisterously, "Hallo, hallo, Suzanne, Janine, bonsoir, Paulette, Simone. Ah, bonsoir, madame." The girls, nearly a dozen lively, pretty ones, welcomed us with exaggerated enthusiasm. Madame was a fragile woman in her 30s, with full, strong black hair. Fred caught me staring at her and advised me, "You can't touch Madame. It's against the rules. Nobody yet has had the luck to conquer Madame, so you had better concentrate on the girls." Madame's exhibits, all of them in their 20s, were unfortunately outnumbered by the men, including some officers of the first flotilla. When the general levity had subsided, the newcomers were introduced and welcomed according to house custom, with a dignified kiss from Madame. Now the fete began in earnest. Champagne sparkled in our glasses, and the girls glowed in our embraces. We danced to the soft music of the record player, sipped the effervescent wine, and tasted the red lips. We kissed the willing creatures as if we had never done so before and might never have another chance. As the evening lengthened, our songs became more animated, our laughter more vociferous, and the girls appeared ever more attractive. We drank the champagne in mounting quantities, and soon our inhibitions, and the girls' laces, fell away. I danced with Janine most of the time. She was suitably ardent. I wondered when the time would come to take her away from the party. However, the etablissement's main offerings would have to await another preliminary. Ballard, a U-boat chief, called out, "Madame, now please present us with one of those action-packed movies." His request was greeted with cheers. "But, messieurs," Madame protested, "isn't it too late for a show? The girls have yet to perform." "Never mind, dear," Ballard said. "The night's still young. We have forgotten too much of life at sea. First, let's have a refresher course." Bowing to pressure, Madame sighed. "I understand your wishes, as any mother does." I put one arm around Janine's slender waist, grabbed a fresh bottle of champagne, and followed the group into an upstairs room. The lights were turned off, the projector began to hum, and the film to roll. The hour that followed was truly educational. The movie taught us graphically that love without art is like a racing car without a driver. I emerged from that show full of new ideas. Janine was the first one to benefit from the lesson. It was morning when I paid the tariff to the old concierge and stepped out into the fresh sea breeze. At the naval compound, things went their usual way. I did my paperwork. I made frequent inspections at the shipyard to see that the overhaul of U-230 progressed according to schedule. I met more old friends from the early days of the war and visited classmates at the quarters of the first flotilla, where I had been in December of 1941. I repeatedly heard of U-boat aces who had not returned from patrol. The year that had been so highly successful had also been full of sacrifices. The expansion of the U-boat war had brought about losses among my friends, and many newcomers to the front had found watery graves instead of fiery triumphs. The weeks in port passed like April showers. Our joys and amusements were but brief compensation for what we had endured in combat. The fires of life burned high, and we stirred them ever higher. I frequented the meeting places of Brittany's gourmets, had unforgettable lobster dinners in the Sea Commandant, a local German restaurant, spent a peaceful evening at the fireside of our castle resort in the country. Then there were the nights in the casino bar with Janine. These were the nights when our wild energies of youth were tamed by Madame's girls of pleasure, nights in which we disengaged from war and duty. But during silent hours of solitude in my room, I was always reminded that the battle in the Atlantic was far from over. The memory of the fury and destruction we caused flashed vividly in my mind. The bellowing explosions of torpedoes, depth charges, and bombs rang loudly in my ears. These were the hours that forced me to think of how dangerously the battle was changing. The front had been brought much closer to shore. It now lay only 2 hours from port, where sky and water met in the west. That was the thin line between war and peace. Our chief returned from his leave in mid-April. I saw Friedrich, still wearing his beard, enter the mess hall during dinner, and I went to greet him. "Hello, old sailor. How was the hero received at home?" "With pipes and drums. You see, I kept the beard. The kids loved it, so I let it grow." He told me that he had spent too much of his leave riding trains and visiting relatives, and he was glad to be back. I briefed him carefully on the status of our boat and related developments. I was less precise in describing our escapades. However, when Riedel, also a bachelor, returned on the evening express from Paris, I freely told him of the cheerful life and had no difficulty in introducing him to the paths of pleasure. Soon all the crew members on furlough drifted back from their homes halfway across Europe. The captain arrived positively relaxed. The stress lines of his first patrol had disappeared from his face. So had the flaming red Viking beard. Several days of intense activity replaced 3 leisurely weeks. The efficient shipyard had completed U-230 as scheduled, and the fitting out would take but 4 days. My last night in port was a quiet one. I was troubled by thoughts of what the next patrol might bring, and tried to concentrate on writing a few letters. I asked Marianne to be extremely careful, and told my parents that I would be silent for a while. Around midnight, I finished packing my belongings for storage. A new order required us to file a testament together with the detailed list of the contents of our luggage. There was not much I had to give away. But when I signed my will in the sombre seclusion of my room, I had the feeling that I had signed my life away. And I wondered whether I would ever retrieve that envelope again, or whether someone else would open it to execute my modest last requests. April 24th, 1943. U-230 lay in the shadow of her concrete berth, lines removed from the pillars. Her company stood in closed ranks on the aft deck, facing the farewell party on the pier. The men had flowers fastened at their caps or in the buttonholes of their olive-green fatigues. Beneath them, the oily water was beaten up by our screws, which turned silently in reverse. U-230 detached herself gently from the concrete wall and sailed, stern first, out of the shadowy darkness of the protective bunker into the blazing sun. At the same time, a second boat, U-456, separated from another pier and followed in our wake. Her orders were the same as ours. On her bridge I saw Forster, a frequent companion at Madame's, and we waved to each other. Then our boat rapidly increased the distance to land and friends. Once we passed the centre of the bay, everything on board was at war, the actions, the spoken words, and the thoughts. It was as if there had been never a port, never a leave, never a jovial moment at the casino bar, never a night in the arms of a woman. U-230 sped at 17 knots over a smooth surface, under a sky full of high clouds. U-456 raced on parallel course 500 metres to starboard. Astern, the escort disappeared behind the horizon. Ahead, the grey sky blended with the green of the sea. We ran along, keeping a close watch on our radar detection gear. Our boat had been equipped with a new electronic instrument, an improved version of the Biscay Cross. The bulky cross had to be removed before submergence, but the new small antenna of the Metox was welded to the rim of the bridge and offered no interference with our emergency dives. Feeble impulses had been accompanying us ever since we left port. As they increased in volume, ZJ-230 made a perfect routine dive, with 456 following only seconds behind us. That was when we lost contact with U-456, which continued on her own track into our allotted area. At nightfall we surfaced to try our luck and run for mileage. With a hull full of fresh air and both diesels charging her batteries, U-230 thrust forward. The infinity of the night sky and the dark expanse of the sea fused in the distance and created the illusion that we were sailing through the universe. Alone between heaven and sea, our black boat sped along in the midst of the large phosphorescent whirlpool that she whipped up, a perfect target for an alert pilot. While the diesels hammered their steady beats, I counted the minutes that we were allowed to travel on surface. 17 minutes passed. Then there was a screaming radar impulse. Detection. We dived at once. The nights became our days, and the days became our nights. The hours inside the hull were spent in darkness lit by a few dim bulbs, and the nights on the bridge were as black as tar. We continued our advance with our ears tuned to the enemy above and our eyes glued to the Black Sea, always ready to duck the bombs that came hurling down from the sky with alarming frequency. and during daytime we floated at a depth of 40 meters, listening to the distant but intimate sounds of propellers, ASDIC pings, and detonating depth charges and bombs. As April gave way to May, we reached the Black Pit area, where no enemy aircraft had yet penetrated. Above us, Hell 153. Radar impulses had gradually ceased, and we dared to stay surfaced under the sun again. After playing hide-and-seek for 6 nights and days, after being thrown into shock, dismay, fear and anger by the British audacity, I considered the sun the guarantor of our survival. Its light enabled us to see clearly and far. By using our eyes and the METOX, I was hopeful that we would be able to spot the black flies at a safe distance. After we had passed the 15th longitude west, we informed headquarters that we had made safe passage through the Bay of Biscay. 4 hours after base had acknowledged receipt of our message, Riedel received and decoded new instructions. Proceed into Grid Square BD 95. Expect eastbound convoy. The area of operation was far below the stormy northern region where we had been during the winter months. I expected better shooting conditions as well as a faster convoy hunt. The strain of the march through the bay was soon erased by a series of beautiful days, undisturbed by enemy planes. May 2nd. The weather was serene, the sea calm and iridescent. At 14:08, Riedel spotted a fast-moving target behind the southern horizon, a loner. We raced at the highest speed on a track that would intersect the vessel's mean course. After 3 hours of running, during which we left the cargo ship cautiously behind the horizon, we dived leisurely, having plenty of time before the vessel would become visible. 1 hour later, our hopes of shooting the first torpedo vanished. The ship was identified as a Swedish freighter travelling the Philadelphia route, which we had guaranteed as a safe path for neutrals. After we had allowed the Swede to pass, we intercepted a signal from one of our boats. Convoy in AJ 87 course northeast, sunk 2 total 13,000 tons. Keep contact. U-192, Grid Square AJ 87 lay between Newfoundland and Greenland, far beyond our reach. We had to leave the convoy to wolves patrolling that area. May 5th. U-230 charged toward her allotted square. 154 iron coffins. During the morning, we intercepted a signal that confirmed our worst fears. Riedel handed me the deciphered message in silence. Destroyer, attacked, sinking, U-638. This report was the last act of U-638. Nothing was heard of her again. 2 hours later, a fresh distress signal was hastily decoded. Attacked by destroyers. Depth charges, leave boat, U-531. This second alarming call alerted us to the fact that the battle at that convoy had produced unusually fierce counter measures by its defence. May 6th. It was still dark when another signal from the battlefield flashed across the Atlantic. Attacked by corvette. Sinking. U-438. This third death message angered and puzzled us. What caused this sudden stream of messages which told us of nothing but dying? Now another was intercepted. Aircraft, bombs, rammed by destroyer. Sinking, U-125, a fourth casualty. Our anger changed to shock. May 7th, U-230, cruising with extreme caution under a star-strewn sky, intercepted still another last report. AIR attack. Sinking, 47N05W, U-663. I checked the victim's position on our mildewy chart and marked the spot of her destruction in the centre of the Bay of Biscay, with a black cross. She was the 5th boat to go to the bottom within 3 days. But 7 hours later I had to revise the total when, after repeated requests by headquarters to report their positions, U-192 and U-531 had not answered. They had met their fate while attacking that convoy southeast of Greenland. May 10th. It was a sunny day. We arrived in the designated square, a small area almost in the centre of the Atlantic. Here we were supposed to intercept the convoy reported earlier. With us in ambush lurked 6 boats, and many more sailed between our patrol and the British Isles. U-456, our companion since our departure from Brest, hid somewhere behind the horizon. The trap was set. Above us, Hell 155, May 11th. Another obituary, again originating in the Bay of Biscay, attacked by aircraft, sinking, U-528. We were outraged and determined to pay back the loss of our friends 100-fold. 1 hour later, we received, as a consolation, attack orders from headquarters, all U-boats in grid square. BD intercept eastbound convoy in BD 91. Attack without further orders. At once we set U-230 on a new course at high speed. Her bow split the water ahead into 2 sparkling fountains. Preparing for action, I ordered a complete overhaul of all torpedoes. May 12th. At 400, the tension was apparent throughout the boat as I mounted my watch. At 5:40, as the new day dawned, Prager shot several stars and established our position. At 6:20, he reported from below that we had arrived on the convoy's calculated mean track. I reduced our speed and turned U-230 onto a westward course toward the convoy, cautiously probing ahead. The eastern sky turned blood red as the sun prepared to rise over the horizon. Only a thin line in the west remained dark. 06:15. The sun shot like a fireball out of the ocean. At that spectacular moment, I spotted a smear over the southwesterly horizon, the convoy. I called Siegmann to the bridge and said as he arrived, "I have a present for you, sir." "Thanks, exec. Encouraging news at last." We watched the smudge grow bigger and wider. Soon the captain turned the stern of the boat toward the grey and black fumes. 3 mastheads crept over the sharp horizon in the west and mounted higher. Emerging fully, the 3 ships were seen to be escorts, the sweepers in front of the convoy. They zigzagged closer, moving jerkily like puppets on an empty stage. We proceeded slowly eastward, maintaining a safe distance to determine the convoy's exact course. 06:38. Mastheads appeared over a wide section of the horizon. Then the funnels followed. These were the cargo ships, the targets we were after. A mighty display of masts and funnels rose ever higher out of the sea. We were almost dead ahead of the parade, in an excellent position. Within 1 hour, I calculated, we would have plenty of targets at our disposal. 06:55. Siegmann acted. "Clear the bridge, on diving stations." I was in the conning tower as the alarm bell sounded the call to action. 5 minutes later, the boat was properly trimmed and floated just below the surface. The captain, seated at the scope, informed the crew over our intercom system. "We have sighted an extremely large convoy, probably over 100 vessels. We shall attack submerged. I need not remind you that this is no holiday cruise. I expect your utmost effort to make this attack a success." Then he activated the motor of the scope. The 07:05. No visible contact yet. Siegmann ordered all tubes prepared for firing. 07:10. I reported U-230 combat ready as the convoy's thumping roar spread through the depths. 7:15. The soundman conveyed news that ruined our plan for a submerged assault. "Convoy apparently has changed course. Sound band changed to 310. The captain, visibly annoyed over the unexpected change, raised the scope further into the air to catch a view of the parading fleet. The high-pitched spinning of escorts' propellers echoed through the water, and the grinding noise of the huge armada hit our hull like the beating of countless jungle drums. "Damn dirty trick," muttered Siegmann. "The convoy zigzags to the northeast. There are at least a dozen corvettes spread over its starboard side." The convoy steamed away at 11 knots while U-230 floated undetected by the outer defence, unwilling to attack till she had passed through the cordon of destroyers. The rhythmical thrashing of 100 propellers penetrated the heavy steel of our hull and bounced forth and back inside the boat. The captain relinquished his seat at the scope, snarling, "Come over here, exec. Take a look. If I only had a faster boat, I could roll up the convoy like a carpet." I swung into the seat. 7 miles on port, I saw an amazing panorama. The entire horizon, as far and wide as I could see, was covered with vessels, their funnels and masts as thick as a forest. At least a dozen fast destroyers cut the choppy green sea with elegance. As many as 24 corvettes flitted around the edges of the convoy. I said in awe, "Quite a display of power, sir. It's probably the largest convoy ever." "You might be right. Once we are close to that wall of ships, our torpedoes can't miss." Before we could risk surfacing to race into a new attack position, we had to put distance between us and the convoy. The swishing of propellers, the pounding of piston engines, the singing of turbines, and the chirping of Aztec pings accompanied us on our clandestine run. For almost 2 hours we travelled diagonally away from the giants of steel. 09:15. U-230 surfaced. Mounting the bridge while the deck was still awash, I took a hurried look in a circle. Far to the northeast, mastheads and funnels moved along the sharp line which divided the ocean from the sky. U-230 forged through the sea, parallel to the convoy's track, in an attempt to reach a forward position before dusk. Riedel flashed the message of our contact to headquarters and the other wolves in ambush. "Convoy BD 92. Course northeast 11 knots. Strong defence. Remain surfaced for attack. U-230. 0955. A startled cry at my back. "Flugzeug!" I saw a twin-engined plane dropping out of the sun. The moment of surprise was total. "Alarm!" We plunged head over heels into the conning tower. The boat reacted at once and shot below surface. At this moment of our maximum danger and minimum ability to act, our lives depended upon a miracle, an accident, or the good luck that had so far saved us from extinction. 4 short, ferocious explosions shattered the water above and around us. The boat trembled and fell at a 60-degree angle. Water splashed, steel shrieked, ribs moaned, valves blew, deck plates jumped, and the boat was thrown into darkness. As the lights flickered on, I saw astonishment in the round eyes of the men. They had every right to be astounded. The attack out of the sun was a complete mystery. Where had the small plane come from? It did not have the range to fly a round trip between the nearest point of land and the middle of the Atlantic. The conclusion was inescapable that the convoy launched its own airplanes. It seemed highly likely, though we did not want to believe it, that the planes returned to convoy and landed on an aircraft carrier. The idea of a convoy with its own air defence smashed our basic concept of U-boat warfare. No longer could we mount a surprise attack or escape without meeting savage counterattacks. 10:35. U-230 came up to periscope depth. A careful check with our sky scope, an instrument similar to the periscope, revealed no aircraft. We surfaced at high speed. The hunt went on. We pressed forward obstinately, with that terrible constriction in the stomach. The diesels hammered hard and pushed the boat swiftly ahead. I glanced only occasionally at the dense picket fence along the horizon and concentrated on the sky. Thickening white clouds scudded along at medium height under a stiff breeze from the west. The wind pitched the water up on deck and once in a while blew a sheet of spray across the bridge. 11:10. I detected a glint of metal between the clouds. It was a small aircraft, and it was diving into the attack. "Alarm!" 50 seconds later, 4 explosions nearby taught us that the pilot was a well-trained bombardier. Shockwaves rocked boat and crew. Friedrich, struggling to prevent the boat from sinking, caught her at 180 metres, balanced her out, and brought her up to periscope depth. 11:25. U-230 surfaced. We drove forward and clung to the fringes of the convoy with grim determination. Instinct forced us ahead, kept us moving despite the constant threat from above, made us numb to the repetitious detonations. We raced in defiance of fear and sudden destruction, always forward toward the head of the convoy. 42. Aircraft! Alarm! U-230 plunged into the depths. 4 booms twisted the hull, but the boat survived the savage blows. We waited for the plane to disappear with our hearts beating under our tongues. 12:04. We surfaced in an increasingly choppy sea and surged ahead, the boat jolting and shaking. The convoy had slipped into a northwesterly position, and despite our constant harassment, we had gained considerable headway on it. I spotted the escorts on the horizon, but the real danger lurked above. The clouds had lowered and thickened, covering the last patches of blue sky. 1208. A call from below reached us on the bridge. Message for captain, signal just received, attacked by aircraft, sinking, U-89. Again we were stunned. With a shudder, I pictured what would happen to us once our own hull was cracked. 12:17. Aircraft dead astern. Alarm! U-230 dived once more and descended rapidly. I bit my lip and waited for the final blast. At 45 seconds, 4 booms whipped the boat with violent force. Every second we were able to snatch from the pursuing aircraft brought us closer to the convoy and success. But if we dived a second too late, bombs would end our hunt with sudden death. 12:30. We surfaced again. This time only 3 men went to the bridge, the captain, the first seaman's mate, and I. We raced ahead stubbornly, plagued by the thoughts of being annihilated within the hour. 13:15. A twin-engined plane dropped suddenly out of a low cloud, only 800 metres astern. It was too late to dive. After freezing for a horrifying instant, Siegmann yelled, "Right full rudder!" I jumped to the rear of the bridge to shoot while the mate manned the second gun. The small aircraft grew enormous fast. It dived upon us, machine-gunning the open rear of the bridge as the boat turned to starboard. Neither the mate nor I were able to fire a single bullet. Our guns were jammed. The aircraft dropped 4 bombs, which I saw falling toward me, then roared over the bridge so close that I could feel its engine's hot exhaust brush my face. 4 bombs in a row erupted alongside our starboard saddle tanks. 4 high fountains collapsed over the 2 of us at the guns. U-230 was still afloat, still racing through the rising green sea. The aircraft, having used up its bombs, turned and disappeared into the direction of the convoy. 13:23. Our radio mate delivered an urgent message to the captain. Attacked by aircraft, unable to dive, sinking. 45, north 25, west, help, U-456. Have Praga check position, Siegmann shouted back. Maybe we can save the crew. The captain's impulse to rescue our comrades might well result in suicide. We were closer to death than to life ourselves. But help was imperative. We would have expected the same. Moments later, Praga reported that U-456 was only 12 miles ahead, 15 degrees to starboard. Immediately the captain changed course. Tart. We spotted a plane circling 4 miles ahead. Then my glasses picked up the bow of U-456 poking out of the rough sea. The men clung to the slippery deck and to the steel cables strung from bow to bridge. Most of them stood in the water up to their chests. The aircraft kept circling above the sinking boat, making it foolhardy for us to approach. Another danger prevented rescue. Astern, a corvette crept over the horizon, evidently summoned by the plane. Now our own lives were in jeopardy. We tinned away from the aircraft, the escort, and U-456, and fled in the direction of the convoy. 14:22. Aircraft astern. Again it was too late to dive. The single-engined above US Hell 161 plane came in low in a straight line exactly over our wake. I fingered the trigger of my gun. Again the gun was jammed. I kicked its magazine, clearing the jam. Then I emptied the gun at the menace. The mate's automatic bellowed. Our boat veered to starboard, spoiling the plane's bomb run. The pilot revved up his engine, circled, then roared toward us from dead ahead. As the plane dived very low, its engine sputtered, then stopped. Wing first, the plane crashed into the surging ocean, smashing its other wing on our superstructure as we raced by. The pilot, thrown out of his cockpit, lifted his arm and waved for help. But then I saw him disintegrate in the explosion of the 4 bombs which were meant to destroy us. 4 violent shocks kicked into our starboard side astern. but we left the horrible scene unharmed. The downing of the aircraft must have upset the enemy's flight schedule. Minute after minute passed without a repetition of the attacks. Running at highest speed, U-230 gained bearing ahead of the convoy. In about an hour we approached the calculated intersection with the convoy's track. 15:45. A report from the radio room put our small victory into proper perspective. Depth charges by 3 destroyers. Sinking. U-186. This new loss was the 11th we had heard of since our patrol began. A naval disaster seemed to be in making. But we could not afford a moment of sorrow for all the men who died that one death that every submariner pictures 1,000 times. 1600. U-230 cut into the projected path of the convoy. I saw 4 columns of ships creep over the sharp horizon in the southwest, headed in our direction. We had to halt them, had to spread fire in their midst and blow gaps in the mass of steel and iron. Erdo 3. Aircraft, bearing 320. We plummeted into depth. 4 detonations, sounding like one, drove the boat deeper and caused rudders and hydroplanes to block in extreme positions. Minutes later, more explosions occurred in the vicinity, but in defiance of our attackers, Siegmann ordered his boat to periscope depth. He raised the scope but downed it instantly, cursing angrily. "Verdammt! The fellow has dropped a smoke bomb and has dyed the water yellow." Despite the dye marking the spot of our submergence, the captain ordered an attack on the convoy before the escorts could attack us. Chirping ASDIC pings, bellowing detonations, and the grinding roar of 100 engines provided grim background music for our assault. 16:38. Up periscope. Then, tubes 1 to 5 stand ready. Tubes 1 to 5 are ready, I answered quickly, then held my breath. Siegmann swiveled around to check the opposite side. Suddenly he cried, "Down with the boat, Chief! Take her down for God's sake! Destroyer in ramming position! Down to 200 metres!" I fully expected the bow of a destroyer to cut into the conning tower momentarily. As the boat swiftly descended, the harrowing sound of the destroyer's engines and propellers hit the steel of our hull. It grew so fast and echoed so deafeningly that we were all unable to move. Only our boat was moving, and she went downward much too slowly to escape the blow. An ear-shattering boom ruptured the sea. A spread of 6 depth charges lifted the boat, tossed her out of the water, and left her on the surface at the mercy of 4 British destroyers. The screws of U-230 rotated in highest revolutions, driving us ahead. For seconds there was silence. For seconds the British were baffled and stunned. After a whole eternity, our bow dipped and the boat sank and sank. A new series of exploding charges lifted our stern with a mighty force. Our boat, entirely out of control, was catapulted toward the bottom 5 miles below. Tilted at an angle of 60 degrees, U-230 tumbled to 250 metres before Friedrich was able to reverse her fall. Floating level at a depth of 230 metres, we thought we were well below the range of the enemy's depth charges. U-230 was speedily rigged to withstand pursuit. Once again we were condemned to sit it out in crushing depths. 16:57. Distinct splashes on surface heralded the next spread. A series of 24 charges detonated in quick succession. The bellowing roar slammed against our boat. The explosions again pushed her into a sharp down tilt, while the echo of the detonations rolled endlessly through depths. 17:16. A new spread deafened us and took our breath away. The boat listed sharply under the shattering blow. The steel knocked and shrieked, and valves were thrown into open position. The shaft packings leaked, and a constant stream of water soon filled the aft bilge. Pumps spouted, the periscope packings loosened, and water trickled into the cylinders. Water everywhere. Its weight forced the boat deeper into the depths. In the meantime, the convoy crawled in a thunderous procession over our boat. 17:40. The uproar was at its peak. A sudden splash told us that we had 10 or 15 seconds to brace against another barrage. The charges went off just beyond lethal range. While the ocean reverberated under the blasts, the bulk of the convoy slowly passed the spot of our slow execution. I pictured the freighters making a detour around the escorts massed above to end our existence. Perhaps we should risk going deeper. I did not know where our limit was, where the hull would finally crack. No one knew. Those who had found out took their knowledge into the depths. For hours we suffered the punishment and sank gradually deeper. In a constant pattern, spreads of 24 charges battered our boat every 20 minutes. At one time we thought we had won. That was when the escorts departed and rushed to take their positions in the convoy. But our hope was short-lived. The hunters had only left the coup de grace to the killer group following in the wake of the armada. 2000. The new group launched its first attack, then another, and another. We sat helpless 265 metres below. Our nerves trembled. Our bodies were stiff from cold, stress, and fear. The mind-searing agony of waiting made us lose any sense of time and any desire for food. The bilges were flooded with water, oil, and urine. Our washrooms were under lock and key. To use them then could have meant instant death, for the tremendous outside pressure would have acted in reverse of the expected flow. Cans were circulated for the men to use to relieve themselves. Added to the stench of waste, sweat, and oil was the stink of the battery gases. The increasing humidity condensed on the cold steel, dropped into the bilges, dripped from pipes, and soaked our clothes. By midnight, the captain realized that the British would not let up in their bombardment, and he ordered the distribution of potash cartridges to supplement breathing. Soon every man was equipped with a large metal box attached to his chest, a rubber hose leading to his mouth, and a clamp on his nose. And still we waited. May 13th. Over 200 canisters had detonated above and around us by 0100. Several times we had used a ruse in an effort to escape. Through an outboard valve, we repeatedly expelled a great mass of air bubbles. These screens of air floated away on the current, reflecting the ASDIC impulses like a large solid body. But our attackers were fooled into chasing the decoys only twice, and both times they left at least one vessel behind, directly over our heads. Unable to sneak away, we gave up the game and concentrated on conserving our power, our compressed air, and our dwindling supply of oxygen. 0400. The boat had fallen to 275 metres. We had been under assault for 12 hours, and there was no sign of relief. This day was my birthday, and I wondered whether it would be my last. How many chances could one ask for? 0800. No lessening of the attacks. The water in the bilges rose above the deck plates and splashed around my feet. The bilge pumps were useless at this depth. Whenever a charge erupted, the chief released some compressed air into the tanks to assure the boat's buoyancy. 1200. The boat's down angle had sharply increased. Our compressed air supply was dangerously low, and the boat slipped ever farther away. 2000. The air was thick, and even more so as we breathed it through the hot cartridges.